might be kind of, just take away what feels useful, and yeah, we can kind of circle back at the end with some Q&A, and yeah, hopefully it'll be informative. It's a very big topic, a very controversial topic in some areas. Even when me and Nikki were putting this together, we learned a lot and found ourselves questioning and looking into different things. Some of the stuff was confusing for us as well, So we understand that, yeah, there's a lot to this topic. So hopefully this will kind of shed a light on a few different areas.
Absolutely. As Paul said, it's a really big topic as well, but we will try to focus on practical elements as well to make sure that you come away with some really practical tips that you can use as well to navigate through the food labels. It can be quite confusing to decipher them, and especially all the jargons that you can see on the labels. So our intention here is to provide you with some clarity and some best practices as well that you can apply.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and just to mention it again, if you at any stage would like to switch off the cameras, it's completely fine. So whatever you are comfortable with, everyone is muted by default because of the background noises. And if you have any questions during the webinar, just pop it in the chat box, so we'll come back to it. And I think we might just get started now.
Yeah.
We have a few minutes, and then everyone can join afterwards as well. So let's get started, and a very warm welcome everyone to our food labeling workshop. We are really happy that you joined us this evening. So my name is Nikki, and I'm the lead health coach at Beyond BMI. And today I'm joined by Paul as well, who is also a fellow health coach in Beyond BMI.
Hey everyone.
And I see a few Beyond BMI clients here. However, just in case, Beyond BMI is a medical-based weight management program, and if you're interested in the program or the company itself, please feel free to visit our website as well, where you can book a free care coordinator calls and go through some of your questions about the program. But today we will be talking about food labels. And as we mentioned briefly, our intention here is to provide you some strategies and tools that you can use to make more informed food choices when it comes to your groceries and the supermarkets. So we will be helping you to decipher some of those food labels, giving you some strategies and tools around or things to try to avoid and how to make a bit more mindful choices about what we buy. So we will be talking about ingredient lists, additives, serving sizes, sugars, fats. So a lot will be covered today. However, we are recording this call, so you will be able to rewatch it. And again, feel free to ask us any questions.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to kind of frame this a little bit, like when we're talking about the concepts in this, like we're really talking about, processed, packaged, sometimes ultra processed foods. And these foods are really designed for like a longer shelf life. And that means that there's going to be lots of things like preservatives, additives, salt, sugars, many different things that's going to go into these products to kind of ensure that. So that's the kind of context of what we're really speaking about here. The other thing to kind of remember as well, like a lot of manufacturers, they really want to kind of distract you and sell you a story and kind of, slightly kind of mislead you sometimes or draw your attention away to maybe what's inside the box as well. So just to kind of know that they use a lot of these kind of tactics to kind of distract us by, using like colorful cartoon imagery, especially on like cereals and things like that, that might kind of move our attention away from what's actually inside. So this is why we have to kind of have a little bit of savvy and know-how around how to kind of look past some of these visual things that look enticing to actually get to the kind of the crux of the matter of like, is this food actually going to be beneficial to my well-being?
So when it comes to the health claims on the food labels, I'm sure you came across multiple times claims that says heart healthy, helps aid digestion, it's good for you, or maybe something general that it's healthy. So the good news is that these health claims are very rigorously tested, and they have to be approved through a very strict criteria. So in general, manufacturers are only allowed to put any kind of health claims if it has been approved and there is some proof behind it. The only exception here is that food products can never claim to treat or prevent diseases or certain health conditions, but things like helping to maintain heart health is something they can do, but only if they provide some proof or some evidence. One of the best examples here that you might be familiar with is a margarine like Flora that claims that it lowers cholesterol. So Flora had to provide some form of evidence to be able to claim that on the food labels. And if you have a quick look at the ingredient list, but also on the front of the packaging, you can see on the right side in the red arrow that it says it has active plant sterols. And looking at the ingredient list of this margarine, it indeed has some plant sterols. So plant sterols are plant-based substances, and it mimics cholesterol, and it has been proven in the past by research that plant sterols have beneficial effect on our cholesterol level. So indeed there has been a research that has provided this information, so Flora can actually use this claim on the label. Does it necessarily mean that that product is absolutely healthy and good for you? Not always, of course. However, the health claims have been quite rigorous when it comes to the approval process. So when it comes to the ingredient list, that's something that's quite a practical rule that you can apply. The general rule is that it's best to aim for 10 ingredients or less. So if you see that a food product or food packaging has around 10 ingredients or less, that's probably a more conscious choice, a little bit better choice compared to an ingredient list that extends to 30, 40, sometimes even more ingredients, because that just means that probably that food product is closer to a lab than its actual natural form. So that's a very practical tool that you can apply as well. So it's always a good idea to be a little suspicious about foods that have more than 10 ingredients.
Yeah, so this brings us on to the label itself and what to look out for. So each package will have a breakdown of the nutritional facts about that product. However, what's really interesting is that there's some things that manufacturers have to display. So things like energy, fat, saturated fat, carbohydrates, sugar, protein, and salt. So these are mandatory, and they must display this to be declared per 100 grams or per 100 milligrams of that product. So these are the must-haves on the label to kind of look out for. What's interesting is that there's a lot of wiggle room in terms of what they can omit. So things like the fat content in terms of polyunsaturated, monounsaturated fats, polyols, starch, fiber, vitamin and mineral content, which can be very important information, that can be left out sometime as well. So it's not really giving you the full picture of the product. In terms of like framing this, the nutritional facts are kind of looking at the 100 milligram and serving size, but they're also taking into account this reference intake. So we'll just explain a little bit about what that means. So the reference intake, this is again a guide like approved by the European Food Safety Authority, based on an adult with a healthy balanced diet. But what's really important here is that it's based around a 2,000 calorie diet. Okay, so again, it's a guide, not necessarily suitable for everyone. And then within that, you can see there's a breakdown then of the different nutrients between fat, saturates, carbohydrate, sugars, protein, and salt, and their kind of guidelines in terms of the number of grams that you should kind of, in general, try and aim for to kind of have a balanced diet. So while it can be somewhat useful as a relatively kind of, ballpark figure. Again, that might not necessarily completely apply to you. Thing to say here then as well, just in terms of the label, you can see a few examples of, like, in terms of the mineral content here, how much is being showed in that reference intake, and kind of giving you a guideline of, like, how much you're kind of consuming in that day. So just as an example here, one of these products which is aimed at kids, which is really interesting, is that there's no reference intake for children. So these values that you see on the screen here per serving size and per 100 grams, these are based on the requirements of an adult with a 2,000 calorie diet, okay? So really, really useful to know that a child's requirements are far, far less than that. So again, just to be kind of mindful of that when you're looking at the information on the product. So this is a really key thing, is the serving size guide. So something to really pay attention to on the label. So the label is going to display the number of calories per 100 grams, but also in terms of a single serving size. And what's really key here is that single serving size may not necessarily mean the entire container. It may be a slight portion of that. And this practice can be quite misleading as well. So we might think that we're, sticking quite well to this nutrient information, but however, there's an opportunity there without us knowing that we might be eating maybe 2 times, 3 times, or maybe 4 times what we think that we're actually eating. We're not kind of, necessarily sticking to their suggested serving size. So just to kind of give you a visualization of what that might look like, I think this is really useful. So especially maybe when it comes to, like, snacking and our cereals, I know I've definitely kind of experienced this, that, like, what we put in our bowl or what we think is a serving size suitable to us may be far, far, out of alignment in terms of what the manufacturer considers a serving portion size to be. So just to be really, really careful around this, something to really pay attention to. I think this is a really, really useful graphic. So in terms of a tip around this, just look at the nutritional value, look at that serving size in terms of grams, and then maybe you might need to do a rough little calculation of, like, multiplying that to kind of get a better idea of what that means for you. So this might sometimes necessarily mean, like, weighing food and things like that if you want to get, like, hyper accurate results, but you can kind of maybe eyeball it after time as well to kind of gauge, what your specific serving size is. So the next kind of piece of really useful information is the traffic light system. And you'll often find this on the front of the label, or front of a package, I should say. So this gives you a kind of a quick glance at some of the things in the product that you might want to pay attention to, in terms of that you may not necessarily want to include a lot of in your diet, like fat, saturated fat, sugars, and salt. So these are the only things that the label is kind of displaying in the traffic light system. But what does this mean? So let's have a little look at kind of what this stuff is actually telling us. So again, the information is based on the serving size and the reference intake, which we've kind of just been through. It's going to, again, giving us the amount of calories in the very first part. And then it's using this, very familiar color coding scheme to give us a very quick visual representation of what's in there. So red, again, being this, like, a very high amount in that product. And in this case, sugar at 34 grams is a significant amount out of that serving size. And that may be the signal to us then to know that we don't really want to particularly have that very often in our diet. The amber then is more of a moderate medium amount within that product. So again, using your discernment, that may be suitable for you to include, semi-regularly. And then ultimately, again, I guess the good news is, in terms of looking at this, is the green light. That is the kind of goal light, in terms of, like, the more green on this label, the healthier the product generally is, in terms of it has lower amounts of these key, like, nutrients, or like fat and sugars and salt, that you might want to pay attention to in terms of how much you're consuming in your diet. So it can be a really useful, quick visual guide to kind of what's in the packet. But again, it's not giving us all of the information.
Now we are going to talk a little bit about sugar and how we can spot the hidden sugar. So if you remember, Paul mentioned that the reference intake guide recommends no more than 90 grams of sugar per day. Now, out of these 90 grams, heaps are actually natural sugars, so that's 60 grams that they recommend from fruits and vegetables and all that. And 30 grams is the recommended intake of added sugar. So added sugar are the sugars that manufacturers add artificially in very various form, but 30 grams equals to around 7.5 or almost 8 teaspoons of sugar. So this is the free sugar that manufacturers add because of flavor, for example. Now, anyone wants to guess how much sugar we eat, free sugar we eat in teaspoons? So the recommendation is 7.5. How many teaspoons of sugar do you think we eat on average? Anyone wants to pop it in the chat? Okay, I see 50 a day. That's a high number, 30. Okay, that's not bad. So at the moment, on average, in Ireland, we eat around 20 teaspoons of added sugar a day. So again, these are just pure white sugar or different forms of sugars that manufacturers are adding. And the recommendation would be 7.5. So we are a good bit above the curve here. And one question is, okay, that sounds like a really high number, but how do we actually consume that much sugar? And this is where manufacturers are getting really, really crafty. So this is a list of various forms of sugar that you find on the food labels. And this is not a complete list. It's not exhaustive. There are even more of that. Because we are and overall our consumers are becoming more and more conscious about their choices. That means that manufacturers are forced to come up with new names, new terminology. So I can guarantee you that every year there are more and more names for sugar, and this is how manufacturers are trying to hide the fact that they are adding it in. A good rule of thumb, because of the various names, it's really, really difficult to keep all of them in mind. Anything that ends with O's, so dextrose, glucose, fructose, it indicates that it's sugar. Also, anything that ends with syrup, any syrup, that's a form of added sugar as well. And anything that says concentrate, for example, fruit juice concentrate, beet concentrate, all the concentrates are a form of sugar as well. Now, again, you know, there are so many different names here. It's really hard to keep them in mind, but you can try to keep in mind the syrup, glucose, so anything that ends with O's, and that should give you a good baseline. There are certain foods where you might find a lot of added sugar, surprisingly, because you might not be aware that foods, for example, even a can of beans can contain sugar if you're not paying attention. So as a good rule of thumb, anything that's tinned or canned, you should check the label because there is a very high probability that there is an added sugar somewhere there. So even if you pick up a can of beans, for example, on occasion, you might find sugar in the tin or in the can as well. Convenience foods very often has added sugar, so any microwavable meals or the canned products, pasta sauces, any kind of sauces really, or any dressings, they are usually very high in added sugar. Packaged cereals are definitely one of the biggest offenders here, so Cheerios, especially cereals that are targeting children, they tend to be very, very high in sugar. Cereal and granola bars, yogurts, the one that Paul showed you, for example, earlier, that had just one little pack of yogurt targeted children has more than 2 teaspoons of sugar in it. Iced teas and all the condiments, so ketchup, mayo, all the condiments that you find, very high probability of high sugar content. And just a word about the juices as well, because this is also very important. So if you are to consume some juices, if you make sure that it says pure, that's the better and more conscious choice, because manufacturers are only allowed to use the word pure fruit juice if the product actually only contains fruit and nothing else. However, they are permitted to adjust the water level. So that means that, you know, a fruit juice can be still very high in sugar just because it's in purest form, it's actual fruit juice. When you drink fruit juice, the fiber, the packaging of the fruit is being removed. So that means that the sugar in that fruit juice gets absorbed the same way as any free sugar. Now, when it comes to fruit juice drinks, those are the tricky ones because they can contain as little as 5% of actual fruits. So if you were to choose between the pure ones or the fruit juices, just make sure that you select the pure version of the fruit juices. Now, I saw a few questions around the low sugar and no sugar. So when it comes to the low sugar products, it just means that, you know, no sugar has been added in form of the sucrose, glucose, fructose, dextrose, or lactose. However, of course, when we remove the added sugar, they still need to make the product sweet. So this is why they replace it usually with artificial sweeteners. There are a lot of artificial sweeteners out there. Normally, if, for example, the Coke says it has 0 sugar, that means that a 0-calorie artificial sweetener has been added in place of the added sugar. So it actually replaces the calorie as well. So a 0-calorie drink, when it comes to weight management, might be still a better option. Of course, we have to be mindful of the fact that it will have some additive, like some artificial sweetener. However, it's the matter of finding that balance and having a look at your goals as well. If you were to, for example, look into weight management, then perhaps the low-calorie, 0-calorie option is still better. However, when it comes to, you know, our overall health and well-being, perhaps, you know, having a more natural drink is always a better choice. So it's finding that balance.
Yeah, thanks, Nikki. So just to move on to a slightly different area, but there is some relation to what we're talking about with sugar. So we're going to talk a little bit around refined flour and bread. So obviously it's a very common part of many people's diets. So just in terms of how to make more informed choices, this can be really, really useful. So when we're talking about refined flour, what we really mean here is pure white flour that's gone through the process of refining. All of the fiber, bran, germ, all of like the nutrients has been stripped away, and what's left is like this pure white flour. You know, so it's essentially like starch to the body. In terms of how this is represented on the label, it's called wheat flour. So you won't necessarily see white flour. You'll see this term wheat flour, which straight away sounds a little bit healthier than maybe it actually is. So what's useful to know about this, you know, this being like a starch in the body, is absorbed very quickly, just like the free sugars that Nikki was talking around. So in terms of like an area that might kind of spike your blood sugar levels, this could be like an area that you might not be aware of where this could be happening. So again, the other side of the coin as well is that, you know, the essential vitamins and minerals that are, you know, being taken away from the grain, you know, all of this is missing as well. So, you know, white flour, white bread, it's a source of energy, sure, but, you know, is it perhaps the most useful to you in terms of like a balanced diet? See. Okay. So what's the alternative then? So you might see, you know, in terms of other options, there's wholemeal and whole grain. And this is a really interesting area. So in terms of like wholemeal, this is definitely something to really look out for and to probably pick as the number one choice. So again, the wholemeal flour hasn't been through any of this refining process. and it'll still have, you know, all of those nutrients that are useful when we talk about having, you know, like whole grains in our diet. Which is odd because the term whole grain doesn't really have any definition that we could find when we were researching this, which I think is really interesting. So wholemeal is definitely more reliable than whole grain. But the thing then to be mindful of is that, you know, wholemeal breads can often include white flour unless that they state that they're 100% wholemeal. So just to be cautious of that. And just a quick example then. So from this is a very common, well-known brand here in Ireland. On the shelf, these breads look very similar, almost identical packaging and color. Again, you know, depending on your know-how around the labels, this will influence your choice. So on the left, we have the whole grain option, and we can see like the number one ingredient is wheat flour or the white flour. And on the right, then we have the wholemeal option, and we can see that it's 100% wholemeal. And then in the ingredient list, the whole wheat flour is the number one ingredient at this sort of 50% of that product is wholemeal flour. So in this instant, perhaps then the wholemeal option would be the more beneficial choice. So we're going to jump to a very different topic, and we're just going to look quickly at fats. So just something to be mindful of when it comes to, you know, calories and then the quality of fats in our diet. So when it comes to processed food, the source of fat that is most commonly used comes from oil. And in most cases, it's vegetable oil, sunflower oil, rapeseed, palm. These are the most common ones that you'll see, and these are monosaturated fats. However, in ultra-processed foods, these oils may be highly refined, and again, through this refining process, the nutritional value again gets stripped away, and these fats become empty calories. So again, ultra-processed food, very long list of ingredients, maybe lots of different types of these oils. The quality of these oils is in question. So again, just to be kind of mindful of this is really useful to know. Because these oils then can kind of affect the way we absorb omega-3 in our body as well. And again, the quality of the oil may not be particularly great for us. There's one little thing just to be mindful of in terms of fats on a label is just to be wary of hydrogenated or partially hydrogenated oils. So these might be more commonly known as trans fats, and particularly artificial trans fats. And these have been sort of shown to have quite a number of health risks associated with cardiovascular disease and increasing cholesterol as well. However, the good news is that they're much more strictly regulated now here in the EU, and generally they're not in products like they used to be. But if you see products from countries outside the EU, they may potentially be there. So it's quite unlikely, but just something to be kind of mindful of. And then lastly, when it comes to fats, things like omega-3s, which are a really healthy fat for us in terms of our brain and many other areas. These are listed, they are polyunsaturated fats, and this is one of those terms that is not necessarily obligatory to include on the label. So, you know, the healthy fats sometimes may be hidden from the product. Okay, and then we get to this topic of low fat versus full fat, which is, again, quite controversial topic, it seems. But we're just going to give you some facts around it, and then, you know, you can kind of do a little bit of your own kind of due diligence and research into this stuff as well. So just to be really clear on what does low fat mean? So low fat, you know, legally it means that this product must contain less than 3% fat by weight. So that technically is what a low fat product is. Products that say they're reduced in fat must contain at least 25% less fat than the original product. And that's all well and good. But what happens then when you remove that fat, you know? So what happens is that the manufacturers then have to replace what that fat was doing in the product. So fat often brings a lot of flavor, some nutrition, the way it helps bind the product, the consistency of the product, that has all changed. So the manufacturer then becomes forced to kind of add ingredients to make up for that. And that can often be in terms of sugar. That's very common to, you know, make it taste better because the fat is gone, is to add sugars. So low-fat products can and often do have more sugar in them. So if you see that label, it's definitely worth having a quick look and seeing what the sugar content is like. More sweeteners, and again, maybe it might use more additives like things like emulsifiers and stuff like that to take care of that, maybe change of consistency of the product as well. So these are some really important things to just bear in mind when you're choosing low-fat products. Again, there's no right or wrong, good or bad here. It's just weighing up the information and you deciding whether it feels like a good choice for you.
And speaking of additives, we are also going to talk a little bit about another controversial topic, which are the food additives. So now these include all those jargons that are really, really difficult to decipher, and oftentimes they make up the majority of the ingredient list on the labels. So it's really, really difficult to tell sometimes what we put in our bodies. It's important to note as well that food additives are nothing new. We have been using it for centuries, for even probably more, in form of, for example, preserving food through the salt or even sugar. So the problem is that nowadays manufacturers use additives for all kinds of different reasons and purposes, anything from texture to adding flavor to preserving colors. And this is where all the new additives are adding up to become a very, very long list. So we are going to briefly talk about that. So what you see here is the official definition of a food additive. As you can see, even the definition doesn't make our job very easy when it comes to understanding what actually additives are. But the most important thing highlighted is that a food additive is not normally consumed as a food itself, and it is not a characteristic ingredient of the food. So I included a little bit of translation to the official definition here. So basically, the food additive is a substance that is not consumed as a food itself. It's normally not a characteristic of the food. It's added for a technological purpose, and it becomes a component of the food or its byproducts directly or indirectly. So essentially, there are four main purposes for any additives. It's either to restore the color of the product that is lost during processing, to provide the sweetness in low sugar products, for example. It also to prevent the spoiling and the deterioration of the product, or protect against food poisoning. So some additives are there to protect us, but some of them are definitely there just to appeal to us more, or to make the product a bit more appetizing. So one question that comes up, of course, very often is whether food additives are safe or not. So this is a little bit of a controversial topic, because from time to time, I'm sure that you have come across articles before about certain food additives, and there are definitely some that have been linked to certain health concerns. But the most important word here is linked. There is a very strict regulation when it comes to approving food additives. So food additives on their own as individual components are safe. That's the only way they get approved, and they go through very vigorous testing. So on its own, a food additive is very likely safe. However, what has never been tested is the combination of these additives. So what we call a cocktail effect. So very often the food that we eat contains multiple additives, not just one, sometimes 10, 20, or even more additives. And the cocktail effect of these additives are very, very hard to research. So therefore, there is nothing that would provide us any insight about what they really do in combination. So yes, on its own, individually, they are safe. The cocktail effect is really unknown. There are a lot of categories for food additives. So sometimes on food labels, you might see a category, and then in brackets, they give you a bit more insight into what specific additive there is. But you can see on the right side, there are just different categories, from flavorings to colors to emulsifiers and all that. It's standardized across Europe, so it's the same in every country. Whenever a food additive is approved, it gets assigned an E number, so E refers to Europe, and a number as well, and this is standardized across Europe. So that's just something to keep in mind. Individually, I would say they are fairly safe. Just the cocktail effect is something that we need to be mindful about.
Thanks, Nikki. Yeah, so that kind of just raises the question then around organics, and this is another label then that you will see on types of food. Why we're kind of introducing this here is that the regulations around this are very different from conventional foods, and in terms of things like stuff being added, it's a lot more strictly controlled in terms of what can be added in terms of additives. So only about 10% can actually be added in organic food. Again, there's a lot of, hearsay back and forth, organic, is it better? We're just going to offer you a few facts around it, and you can sort of make that decision yourself. So the actual organic label for food to qualify as organic, it has to go through very, very regulated testing and very expensive testing as well. So the actual label itself is pretty trustworthy in terms of a food label. If it has that, certified organic, you can be pretty confident that that food has been, made with organic processes. So that's good news in terms of like most of the pesticides that are used in conventional food agriculture. Those are banned, and it's much more controlled, and some producers often opting to not use any at all. So in terms of that kind of toxic load on our system through food, the organic definitely has a lot more benefits. Studies have also shown, which I think is really interesting, that the organic food has much higher nutrient content than some maybe industrial agricultural produced food. So up to like 40% more antioxidants and much higher mineral amounts, like things like zinc and iron and copper and things like that, which again is really, really useful for us. So organic, is it better? It definitely has a lot of benefits. But just to bear in mind, we're going to look through two different lists that you might be familiar with. So you may have seen these online. So this is the Dirty Dozen and Clean 15. So the Dirty Dozen refers to conventional food with the highest levels of like pesticides and things like that that's used in commercial agriculture to produce them. So again, they may be certain types that are more beneficial to choose the organic types. On the other side, we have the Clean 15, again, using the same methodology, but they have far less levels of pesticides and things like that on them. So I know avocado is a great example where you could buy perhaps a regular avocado than an organic one. The shell is kind of keeping it safe to a certain extent. So again, when you're kind of weighing up the cost of your shopping and things where you want to invest in your health, obviously, you want to make your budget go as far as it can. Some things, it would definitely be more beneficial to perhaps buy the organic food, and there's a little bit more wiggle room in terms of some of the commercially produced foods, like things like avocados, pineapples, stuff like that. You can see at the top there. So yeah, if you're kind of someone who's eaten a lot from the Dirty Dozen list, maybe a switch to the organic can be really useful for you in this instance. Okay. So just to kind of go through the key takeaways then, what we've covered as we kind of come to the end of this part. Yeah, use your discernment, be skeptical about the claims on the box. A lot of it is misleading, distracting, just kind of for the 30 seconds it takes just to check those, those nutritional facts, the serving size, really sort of see if it's suitable for you. Just those extra couple of seconds can make a big difference. Again, looking at the reference intake, it's based on standardization, but it doesn't apply to everyone. Looking at those ingredients, if it's got more than 10, potentially it's not the most useful food for you in terms of your well-being. There's going to be a lot of extra stuff in there that may not be suitable for you. Around fats, look out for the hydrogenated and partially hydrogenated fats, and be mindful perhaps of palm oil and its sustainability if that's something that's important to you. And looking at sugars, this is the big one that, Nikki showed you so many areas where there is just lots and lots of ways manufacturers can add sweeteners and sugars to your food. So we'll send you that handout and make sure that you're kind of aware of some of those terms. I spoke a little bit about the whole wheat versus whole grain in terms of bread. The going for the 100% whole meal is really, really useful. Trying to cut back a little bit on the refined wheat flour, that could be potentially very beneficial for you. And then Nikki gave us a really, really interesting look at the food additives. There's a lot to kind of unpack in that. It's a really interesting area, but I think that big takeaway is around the cocktail effect. We're not particularly sure. There perhaps isn't the studies done to it in terms of how it may potentially affect us. Again, it's a real gray area, so hard to kind of really determine the best practice with that perhaps. And then lastly, looking at the organic label, I think the organic label is a pretty good assurance that's been created with organic processes. And thinking about that dirty dozen, clean 15 list, maybe there's an opportunity there for you to swap out some organic foods there, that in terms of like some regular foods on that dirty dozen list that may be more beneficial for you. Okay.
And now we would like to invite you to some practice. So we included a few labels on the next couple of slides, so we would have a look at that together to see. So this one is a very, very common, quite popular protein bar here. Or I'm not sure if it counts as a protein bar, but definitely one of the claims on the label is that it's very high in protein. So I'm wondering how many forms of sugar do you recognize on the label? So take a minute to read the ingredient list here and just write down the number of sugars or types of sugars that you recognize on this label. So again, anything that might end with syrup or O's like glucose, or even natural sweeteners. Let's see if anyone can guess the number. Okay, I see an 8 there. Okay, some good guesses are coming, 14, 11. Okay, very good. So we can go through it together. So one thing that is also worth to mention is that the ingredients are also always listed in their weight order. So that means that if you pay attention to the first 3 ingredients of your food label, then that product largely contains this 3 ingredient. In this case, let's see the sugars that we find here. So we have dates as a natural form of sweetener. We have, let's say, glucose syrup, cane sugar, so that's free. We have again, more dates on the bottom, date syrup, concentrated grape juice, and chicory fiber. So altogether, that's 7. One thing manufacturers very often do as well to trick you is that instead of labeling sugar as one ingredient, they include multiple sugars in the same food. So this means that if we were to add up all these different sugars, it might be in the top 3 ingredient, but because the manufacturer is using so many different types of sugar, they get away with it, meaning that you won't see on the top of the ingredient list, you might think that it doesn't have that much sugar, but you see it's actually a lot of different sugars added. So glycerol is a good guess. It's not a type of sugar, it's a stabilizer. So that's one of the other additive categories. So here, what we wanted to bring your attention to is one of the examples of products, Cheerios, typical cereals we would eat, that have quite a few claims on the top. So it claims that it has fiber from whole grains. Whole grains, we know it contains a bunch of fiber and also vitamins and minerals. So by the look of it, there is nothing wrong. It seems like a good choice. So when it comes to making better choices or more conscious choices, one thing to note is that a product might still contain a good amount of whole grain. For example, this Cheerios indeed contains the whole grain oat flour, whole grain wheat. So it's all whole grain, which is really good. It's exactly delivering what it's promised. However, when you look at the label itself, within the first line as well, you can already see that there is one type of sugar added, just plain sugar. There's also molasses, another type of sugar. There is caramelized sugar syrup, so that's the third one. And I think when it comes to sugars, these three are the ones that present. So it might be still a good choice because of the whole grain content. However, again, in the ingredient list, you can quickly find out that it has a bunch of different sugars added still. So is it better than the refined flour version or refined version? Probably. It's just about, again, finding that balance and be more mindful that just because a product is a whole grain and it looks good on the front, it might still have a lot of added sugar. So this is where, that 20 teaspoons of sugar adds up. And now that we also touched upon the serving sizes, you can see that a typical value per 30 gram serving, so 30 gram would be a typical serving, but I don't think any of us actually has only 30 grams when it comes to Cheerios. You can see that the added sugar is 5.3 grams, so in just a small 30 gram amount, it has 1.5 teaspoons of added sugar, free sugar added, so that's quite a lot. And normally, because we eat double that per serving, that adds up to like 3 teaspoons in just one sitting. Now, another one that can be an interesting one to study is sausages. So, of course, we don't have any issues with any of the brands, any of the sausages, so we are not against any products here, but just about being mindful of our choices. When it comes to sausages as well, it is really worth to have a look at the ingredient list. For example, this sausage has 60% pork. So it really makes you just wonder what is the other 40% consist of. So that's about bringing your attention to the quality of the product as well. There's nothing wrong in sausages at all. It's more about perhaps finding a product that has a bit more pork. If it's supposed to be a pork sausage, at least having decent amount of pork in it should be a good standard, a good baseline to aim for. Again, when it comes to the sausage as well, it really makes you wonder how many ingredients that sausage needs. Of course, certain preservatives are expected. However, if you see a quite long ingredient list, even on a sausage, perhaps there's a better choice there that could replace it. One interesting thing here is that you can see maltodextrin on the list, which is a sugar. So even a sausage can have some sugar. Now, do you want to take this poll or should I?
Sure. So we thought this one kind of last example might be really useful. Is something that was a very quick go-to option for a lot of us is just to have a quick sandwich, maybe at lunch or on the go. And what we were kind of curious again is is a sandwich a reasonably good option? Yes, potentially. It's such a simple food, right? Some bread and a few ingredients. So we were kind of curious, well, how many ingredients should a sandwich actually really have? It turns out in this case, it's quite a surprising amount considering it's a very, very simple food. So again, the type of sandwich that you might make at home would probably have, far, far less ingredients than something on the go. So again, it can be just an okay choice from time to time. but just to kind of think a little bit about what is actually in something as simple as a sandwich. You know, again, there's lots of sugar on display here as well, lots of wheat flour and things like that, starch, all those sort of things that might be kind of hitting your blood sugar levels a little bit. So we just want to bring this to your attention. You know, sandwiches, again, nothing wrong with them. It's just about making a more informed decision. So just that quick little flip of the packaging to see what's in it, just knowing and being conscious about what you're putting in your body is really, really, really useful. And then lastly, we just want to talk a little bit about Pringles. It kind of came to our mind. Yeah, it's a simple thing of like something that we can often snack on, crisps and such like that. Again, very high in you know, wheat starch. Again, we see maltodextrin here, very high up on the ingredient list. Another type of sugar. Again, sunflower oil, that's the type of fat. Dextrose, again, we might question the quality of the fat that might be used in Pringles, and a few additives there at the end to begin to finish it off. So all it is just like, again, we're not demonizing any of these foods. It's just looking at the information. And when you consider the information, then from that place, making a more informed decision.
Yeah.
Okay. I think that's it. I think we've kind of come to the end. So we would love to hear from you in terms of questions. Thank you so much for your patience and staying to the end. We really, really appreciate you being here. Just having to look in the chat. Protein, is there a good and bad protein? Oh my God, that's from Joe. That's an interesting one. Is there a good or bad protein? Good or bad?
Yeah, we usually try not to label any food good or bad. So when it comes to the protein choices, it's very often about what is important for you as well and what you are comfortable with. So when it comes to the protein, it is something that is quite an individual decision as well. So for example, if you prefer plant-based protein, that's perfectly fine. There are so many options to get your protein in on a plant-based diet as well. And if you consume animal products, you know, it is the same principle. It's more about, again, be mindful about the quality of the products that we eat rather than the type of protein that we consume. So just making sure that the quality of the food, the quality of the meat or the dairy that we are eating is good.
Absolutely. And yeah, the protein bar, yeah, I see that, Joe. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's useful in terms of like protein powders as well. So just to kind of bear that in mind, like not all protein powders are made equally. Some can, again, have a huge list of ingredients. So again, just kind of checking them, seeing, again, are they sort of maybe under 10 ingredients? That can be really useful. What types of sugars, if any, are in them? Yeah, we get this question a lot around protein powders. Again, there's necessarily good or bad. We're not really using that terminology, but again, just how beneficial for it. What is the content and how might that affect my body? Just being mindful of those.
Yeah. I see a question from Carmel about artificial sweeteners and where we stand with it. So that is a really, really good question. I'm sure you might have come across certain articles about aspartame and sucralose, and there are certain concerning artificial sweeteners. They have been linked to some health concerns. At the moment, there is no hard evidence that would, by definition, prove that these are truly damaging to our health. So again, if it was my personal choice, probably I would aim for more natural-based sweeteners like honey, or if you see dates, that's a more whole food form of a sweetener. Or stevia, for example. Stevia is a plant-derived sweetener, so that could be a good option. When it comes to the other sweeteners like sucralose or aspartame, in moderation, again, it can be a more mindful choice over, for example, a high sugar version. It's just about finding that level of maybe a moderate consumption that you are happy with. What about you, Paul?
Yeah, I think you summed that up pretty well. Yeah, it's again just trying to look a little bit more towards nature whenever we can, looking towards whole food and whole food sources. So where if there's some sweetener in it, yeah, like looking at honey or agave or these different things that or maple syrup that may not have the same kind of impact. There's just a big question mark hanging over the artificial sweeteners. So the studies and the research just isn't there at the moment. So it is a bit of a grey area. So can't really make a definitive answer on that at the moment.
It's absolutely a gray area. And perhaps one thing that you could consider if you, for instance, suffer from migraines or headaches very often, or perhaps you have some allergic reactions or symptoms and you don't really know where to put it, it might be worth to, check the foods that you are consuming on a regular basis, because one thing that additives have been linked to is migraine symptoms or certain allergic symptoms. So if you find that there are some mysterious symptoms that you are developing, maybe then in this case, it is worth to eliminate these foods to see if your symptoms improved. So that could be a good experiment to do.
Okay, a question from Rosie: dried fruits versus whole fruits for a snack in terms of sugar. Again, there's no right or wrong or good or bad here, Rosie. Kind of maybe just being mindful of the sugar content. So yeah, dried fruits will tend to have a higher sugar content. So this is a different type of sugar. This is fructose. It's kind of absorbed by the body in a different way. There's room for both of these in terms of your diet, So again, the whole fruit, maybe you'll have perhaps some more fiber, things like that. The dried fruit can be, a nice little addition to, to sprinkle into some cereal or have now and again with some mixed nuts or things. Yeah, it's definitely a source of sugar for sure to kind of consider that. But again, just thinking about balance over how that plays out in terms of like the rest of your diet. If you were eating bags of dried fruit all day, then that might necessarily be the most beneficial choice. But if dried fruit and whole fruit is like just playing a part, as a balanced, ingredient in your diet, then yeah, there's absolutely no problem with that.
Yeah, definitely. And one of the dangers of the dried fruits is it's very easy to overconsume it. So it's just about finding that moderation again, that it might be a little bit easier with whole fruits just because of their water content and the fiber. But for the dried fruits, it's just you need to be mindful of the portion in that case.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So Margaret has asked if cinnamon is good sweetener for cereals. So that's an interesting question. Cinnamon itself is a wonderful spice. Do they use it as a sweetener? I wonder, Paul, do you have any experience?
Is cinnamon good as a sweetener? I think that probably depends on your tastes palate and your taste buds. Maybe I particularly wouldn't find cinnamon particularly sweet, more kind of not necessarily spicy, but kind of quite a pungent flavor. If it works for you, then go for it. Yeah, it's just that thing of yeah.
It's a wonderful spice. It's it has a very strong antioxidant properties. So by all means, if you like cinnamon, just splash it on your coffee or cereal. It's really, really good spice. It's very good for you. Okay, so the next question is, how important is glycemic index of different sugars? So this kind of ties back into that blood sugar spikes that we discussed earlier. So it's really a good idea to be mindful about the different sugars, and the glycemic index is probably quite high in all cases. To be honest, I haven't really looked into the glycemic index of the different sugars, but again, It's about perhaps finding the natural versions a bit more beneficial than any added artificial sweeteners. However, or sorry, sugars. However, I wouldn't know the answer to this question, I don't think. Paul, any insights on that?
Yeah, I think in terms of like the impact on your blood sugar and the glycemic load is like things like free sugars, like the most easily and quickly absorbed sugar in the body. So, like sucrose, dextrose, all of those things, which are just like pure calories, that they are the most quickly absorbed sugars by the body. So that will spike your blood sugar much quicker than say some of the other sugars might be a little bit more slow releasing, and your body might start to process them in a slower way. It will obviously kind of, have that little bump in your glycemic index, but in terms of your bumping your blood sugar levels, but it might be a little bit more gentle as far as I can remember in terms of the more quickly absorbed sugars.
Yeah. So if you find yourself often getting really, really sleepy, for example, certain times of the day, then very often it's because, your blood sugar jumps too high up too far too quickly. If you had a sugary food, or if you had certain foods with a lot of added sugars, that can happen, or even after foods with a lot of refined flours like pastries or white breads. If you are very sleepy afterwards, that's just because, your blood sugar then come crash down, so you will be craving sweets again. So it can be a roller coaster.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, we have one last question from Harriet. What is the psychological impact or consequences of labeling foods as good or bad? Wow, that's a great question. It's very dear to my heart. Yeah, where to start on this? It's a big topic. I think ultimately it kind of feeds into our relationship with food, how we view foods, and then ultimately maybe how we view ourselves based on our interaction with that food. So if we label a food as good, that might be fine, and it's a food rule that we stick to. But if we label a food as bad, then if we then sometimes consume that or overconsume this quote unquote bad food that we label, then it might reflect back on us. We might think that we are bad for consuming a bad food. So there can be judgment that we might bring upon ourselves for doing that, or guilt or shame. Or if we kind of have very strict food rules that, I can only be healthy if I eat good foods. Now that I've broken this rule by eating a bad food, then does that mean that I'm bad for doing that? So that's just a kind of basic example of how I would interpret that question and how I would interpret the good or bad label. And the thing to say is that we're, as humans, we will, put things in categories very quickly. And one of the simplest and easy ways of doing that is sort of good or bad. So again, in terms of our language, it could be very tricky to kind of check that and sort of look at it from more of a neutral standpoint. So if we see food as just neutral, neither good nor bad, but just providing information. So in terms of like dietary information, content, how is it going to serve our body? Then we can kind of just make a more neutral choice. I'll choose this food because it's not necessarily good or bad, but I know that, it has maybe the fiber that I need, or there has the healthy fats in it that's going to nourish my body. So I think it just links in the good or bad to like relationship with food, very strict rules around, how I should and shouldn't eat. And then perhaps by breaking these rules, it may bring in some guilt, maybe spiraling into some binging, or who knows, you know what I mean? It can be very effective in different ways. So definitely something to be really I often try to invite it in when I'm speaking to clients or to people in general, and something in my own life I'm trying to be very mindful of the language I use around food. And the more neutral it is, just looking at it, without that lens of good or bad, then it may be more beneficial in terms of maybe how we see ourselves and our relationship with food as well. Nikki, do you have anything to add with that?
Yeah, it's a really important point that you raised, and thanks for summarizing that, because it was very well put. It is absolutely about our relationship with food, and in reality, food is nor good nor bad. Food is just food. The only difference between two foods is their nutritional value, but that's pretty much it. We do tend to judge our own value based on the food choices that we make, and essentially, it's really easy to fall into that trap of developing an all or nothing mindset, whether I'm good and I'm all in and I'm making good choices, good foods, or I'm being bad because of certain food choices that I make. So these are very judgmental towards ourselves, and it really does feed a very unhelpful relationship with food in general. As Paul said as well, it can really often lead to binging later on, or developing some very unhelpful eating patterns, or maybe even disordered eating. So that's why the language you are using every day when you make your food choices matters a lot. So it's a very simple practice that you can start developing, reframing these things and trying to practice that language of not labeling foods in any way. Just ask a question if it's nourishing you, if it's providing any nutrients, and that's the only questions that you need to ask, as opposed to evaluate your own self and your own success and progress based on a single food group. A single food will not make or break your progress. However, that mindset, that judgment that you display because of these foods definitely can hinder it. So it's very, very important.
Yeah, well said. Absolutely. Okay, everyone. That's, I think, brings us very nicely to the end. And thank you so much for staying with us, giving us your attention and your presence, the wonderful questions, interaction. Thank you so much. It really means a lot to us. We really hope that this has been useful for you in some way and that you got something from it. We will make this available again in terms of like a downloadable. We'll let you know how and where to get that. And yeah, just to say, thank you so much again for being here.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your time. And if you would like us to organize other workshops around certain topics, please let us know. We are very happy to hear your feedback. We can organize other webinars and we are happy to do it. So if there are any certain topics that you would like us to cover, let us know. And have a good evening, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.